Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Be sure to check us out online at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now enjoy this edition of the Midweek Podcast.
So welcome to this week's Midweek Podcast. Not that it's a weekly thing, but it's the one for this week. And I'm with Michael Hughes and Joshua Cutchin. How are you guys doing?
Doing well, thanks. Yeah.
All right, and we're going to continue a little from our last podcast where we talked about evidence in the paranormal, because there was a bunch of stuff we didn't get to that I wanted to get to, and I kind of want to turn the tables on it a little bit. But before we get into some of the stuff we didn't cover, did either of you see the Lizard Man video? I'm taking that to yes.
Yes. Being a North Carolinian, I always try to keep my my antenna tuned into all things Lizard Man. I found it very humorous. Let's say that.
Yeah. I had to wonder if the Gorn Star Trek had maybe gotten loose.
Yeah, and I'm waiting for the Mothra sighting. So.
Oh my God, it did look a lot like a Gorn, though.
Yeah. And Gorn's been popping up lately, too. There's like this renaissance of the Gorn. I've seen him, all over Facebook. So maybe something's in the collective imagination, this Gornian energy.
I used to play lead guitar with Renaissance of the Gorn, actually. So. It's not true, but
someone's got to use that for a band name.
Yeah, right.
But the thing is that's a great example of what doesn't constitute evidence, because it was obviously fake.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it looked for all the world like a guy in a suit. So unless the Lizard Man happens to look like a guy in a suit, but it was trending on Facebook.
Well, and to play devil, I agree with you, Soraya. I do. To play quick devil's advocate, I recall the time that Terrence McKenna said that he saw a flying saucer in South America and said that it looked like an Adamski-style flying saucer and that it looked fake as hell. Yeah. He said it looked fake as hell, but that's what it was. So if we play in the sort of realms that I think we all three like to, which is the idea of co-creation between the witness and the phenomena and what's really happening, I wouldn't doubt for something to be super fake. But having said that, I do not think that's really the Lizard Man.
It was, the Patterson-Gimel film has survived all this time back and forth because it doesn't necessarily look fake.
Mm-hmm.
And that was done in what, the 50s or 60s?
I believe it was the 60s.
Yeah, and so you figure that was done in the 60s, and to this day, no one can definitively say whether it was fake or not because it looks so good.
Yeah.
And then you get this thing, and you're looking at it, and it's like, it's 2015, right? This is the best you could do.
Yeah, I know, right?
Because the suit looks floppy on top of everything else.
Yeah.
But hey, I'll give whoever again, I believe that it's a hoax, but I'll give whoever hoaxed it the credit and say it is not an ambiguous photo.
Well, that's true.
It is true. It looks like a lizard man. I'll give him that. It doesn't look like a real lizard man.
Yeah.
But it's another reason why video footage is never going to be full and complete evidence.
Oh, absolutely. Especially nowadays.
Yeah.
I have a probably like you guys. I have Google alerts, set for all kinds of stuff, and UFO pops up at least, often 15, 20 news stories. A lot of times it's just variants on the same thing, that just gets rehashed on a number of websites. But sometimes I don't even look, at them anymore. It used to be I would, if it sounded like an interesting piece of footage, I would watch it. But now I'm just whatever. If it's really that good, then it'll stick around. But we're just there's just a deluge of this stuff nowadays, and really good hoaxers too. I think the most interesting one I saw was that what was it, like a cube or something coming out of the sky? I don't know if you guys saw that one. It was really well done and weird looking. And lately I've been seeing a lot of the what's that so-called the Black Knight satellite. There's a lot of black black night satellite images popping up lately, and a lot of discussion about that. But yeah, but I think we said on the last show, you just can't, like, you can't grab a hold of anything anymore. You know, my initial assumption is that it's a fake.
Well,
Yeah.
and something that actually is sort of timely in relation to this. Have either of y'all seen the Department of Homeland Security footage, the supposedly leaked footage of a UFO in Puerto Rico?
I did see
No.
that. Yeah, the one that went underwater and then
Yeah,
came
it's
out again.
interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Mhm.
Treading lightly, but Sarai, you should check that out when you get a chance. It's some very interesting. I believe it's thermal footage
Huh.
that propped up, and I think that there is a Roswell slide style investigation group that's taking a look at it. So
Uh-oh, yeah. Yeah, you know, the story of it was that it had, you know, it was directly taken from, you know, Department of Defense or Homeland Security footage or something like that. But, you know, until I see the chain, you know,
Right.
definitively linking back to that source, you know, even though if it's a fake, it's beautifully done. You know, I just have to leave it in that, you know, that gray file, you know,
Yeah.
where it's just where stuff goes, and I can't say yes or no or anything.
no,
You know, I wasn't a big fan of the show UFO Hunters. I thought it was actually pretty poorly done for the most part.
I
But,
agree.
you know, it's a hard thing to you know, UFOs are a hard thing to do a weekly TV show about unless you're just doing UFO history.
Hmm.
But they had shown one clip from a police helicopter of something in the infrared following the helicopter, and I'm watching that going, okay, that's actually really interesting because you could tell it's from a police helicopter. It wasn't faked.
Hmm.
They got the you know, the video from the police and stuff, and they couldn't see it with their naked eye. And the thing's just kind of morphing and spinning and following them. And I'm thinking, okay, that there, I mean, it doesn't prove anything, but that there is interesting UFO footage.
Yeah.
I seem to recall that footage as well. That actually brings up an interesting point, which is I've been sort of turning this idea of paranormal, supernatural evidence over in my mind, and the one thing that the ghost hunters really have going for them that I wish we could capitalize on more is the opportunity for repeatability that you don't have with something like UFOs, unless you have someone that says that they can call down UFOs with their thoughts. You know, you do have this fixed location in a relatively small area with these hauntings. That's unlike going into a forest where Bigfoot is supposed to be, or looking up in the sky, even at places where UFOs are often seen, is a lot less of a guarantee than going into any one of these haunted locations at any given time.
Right.
And I think that if we could somehow convince the scientific community, if we could somehow convince a skeptic to do a tour of 10 haunted locations, at one of those they would leave with a handful of experiences that they couldn't explain, and they could say that something is going on there. But I feel like if we're going to move at least ghost research forward, that we really need to capitalize on this opportunity for repeatability, because that's the only way to get any attention paid.
Yeah, and I think too, it would have to be a very open-minded skeptic. It would have to be a genuine skeptic, not a debunker, because a debunker will find a way to blow anything off.
Right.
Because they've already made up their mind there's nothing there. So if something weird happens to them, well, you know, they'll come up with an explanation no matter how ridiculous it is to blow off the information. But ghost hunting is something we didn't get into last time. Go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say, I think you touched on something really interesting as far as repeatability goes. And that's one thing that the skeptics used to point out. You know, people have seen UFOs more than once, you know, repeat sightings and things like that, which I find fascinating. And I think the repeatability is often tied to the person, which brings up all sorts of other questions. But to a really hardcore skeptic, they're going to say, well, okay, well, why would these things fly from space, and why would this one person, what are the odds of this person seeing 3 UFOs in his life? Whereas, you start talking to people who've had sightings, and a lot of times there are other sightings involved. When you talk to abductees or contactees, things like that, there are typically lots of sightings going back in the person's life. So I think that's where the repeatability lies in the UFOs, not the location, but the people that it happens to.
But here's the thing: if we haven't been able to prove if we haven't been able to prove sufficiently to the establishment the reality of psi phenomena in a laboratory, which is centered around a person, they're not going to buy into UFO phenomena being tied to a person. They're going to demand at some point that person step out of the equation.
Yeah,
True.
yeah, and that's that's why I go back to saying that how we're really going to understand this stuff is not by getting the scientists on our side. Yeah, I would like to think that's going to happen. I think how we're probably going to get the best understandings of the meanings of these assorted kinds of experiences is through anthropologists, through scholars of religion and philosophy and folk, folk stories and things like that. Until something definitive shakes the academic scientific community, they're never going to they're not going to pay attention to any of this stuff.
Right.
And you also, just the way you phrased it, why would they come from space to check out this one person? And it just immediately it has those assumptions that if it's a UFO, it must either come from space or there's nothing there.
Right, exactly.
Most people divide it into two options. We're either being visited by extraterrestrials, or everyone who says they are either crazy or lying.
Yeah, yep.
I think,
and it's like, yeah, go on.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, I think that the dimensional thing is gaining more popularity. I mean, when you have an Indiana Jones film parroting the idea that these entities are coming from other dimensions, then that means that it's gaining some sort of traction in popular culture. But your point is well taken. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but you figure Keel and Valet both kind of posited that idea back in the late 60s, and it's only now starting to really kick in popular culture.
That's a good
and
point.
Even so, we don't even know what it means. When we say other dimensions, I mean, there's so many interpretations of that. It's like, well, what does that even mean other than it comes from somewhere else, other than here?
Mm-hmm.
Are we talking parallel worlds? Are we talking about something completely different? Laird Scranton talks about the Dogon saying that there's two worlds. There's our world and there's a spiritual dimension. And the way he explains it, that the Dogon said it, is that here we experience time, but we can change things. There, they don't experience time. Everything happens at once, and they can't change things.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So, what if they're popping through and interacting with our reality? I mean, we see, especially in John Keel has pointed out how these entities seem to know things about us, simple things they shouldn't be able to know, unless they're looking at us from a perspective we're not familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, this is
they're mining our consciousness somehow.
Right.
Whether it's from a perspective like you were mentioning about the Dogon, that's sort of atemporal, it's out of time, or whether these things just kind of hook in, have a good way to tap into our memories and our thoughts and things like that, because it's clearly a psychic phenomenon. UFOs are a psychic phenomenon, undoubtedly. I don't think anyone who's spent, the minimal amount of time studying this stuff with an open mind can rule that out. And as we touched on previously, this stuff is all psychic phenomenon. Even some of the Bigfoot, Sasquatch things, have some sort of psychic element. It seems, whether the creature is sort of, tapping into what the person's thinking, or so it's all consciousness related. That's the only thing I think I could say definitively that I've come to believe, being in this stuff for so long.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I also don't want to. I mean, I don't necessarily want to fence out the possibility that there's something that hasn't occurred to anybody that it can also be tied into. But yeah, I mean, as I've gone on the record a lot of times saying, consciousness is going to be the key to unlocking this, and I think that that might be a good place for us to, that might be a good place for us to focus our hopes in terms of actually gaining some traction in this field. Because if you can bust apart this mind equals brain paradigm, that opens up a ton of new possibilities. Now, of course, I'm sure that there was somebody saying a similar thing before quantum theory took hold and became, a really fully fledged theory on its own right. I'm sure people were saying, well, if we can just get the idea that there are other dimensions, and that'll blow everything apart and it'll make open minds. But I think that still feels so theoretical that I think the pressure valve on this whole supernatural topic really is going to be consciousness research.
And I think as long as the establishment is stuck in the paradigm that matter has created the brain, which then is creating consciousness as sort of a side effect, I mean, despite the evidence against that, they're not willing to change that viewpoint. And it could take, a couple generations before that shifts.
Did you guys this brings to mind something I just saw a few days ago that's really making a lot of waves. Did you guys hear or read about the study? And I'm sorry, I should have I would have written down the specifics, but I'm sure anyone can Google it. And that's they had people stare into each other's eyes in a dimly lit room. Did you see that?
I saw something from a while ago about that.
Yeah, this is pretty recent, and it's published in a decent, respectable journal, and these psychology researchers had people, dyads, so it's two people, and they would stare into each other's eyes for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, something like that, and in a fairly dim room, so you could still see the person's features, but it wasn't a really bright room. And the people started having these incredible visions and altered states, and the person's face would change into someone else's or mirror their own. And I mean, just reporting these intense altered states, just from looking and staring, for a long time into someone's eyes. And then the research is apparently associated with some other research of mirror gazing. And so this was, this caught my attention because this is a scientific study of scrying, but it's also something that that magicians have known for millennia. And anyone who's gone to like a tantric workshop or a new age workshop in the past 30 or 40 years has done like the eye gazing thing, but it was just fascinating to me that the scientific study is now looking at this and they're going, this is pretty crazy stuff. Of course, the default is, well, it's a glitch in our wiring and therefore whatever. It's immediately kind of taken apart from an evolutionary biological perspective, when I'm thinking, well, good, now you've quantified that this thing exists. Find out what it's useful for. Like talk to the people. What did it make them think? How did it make them feel?
Well, I feel like for millennia, at least centuries, we were waiting for religion to catch up with science. We were like, look, there were thinking people who were persecuted, burned at the stake. Bruno realizing that stars were individual suns, and I feel like now we're at a point where we're waiting for science to catch up to religion, or at least science to catch up to spirituality. I think that there's been a shift where there are some bedrock fundamental truths that people who have dealt in the esoteric have always known, that science is just now coming around to being like, oh, well, maybe there is some validity to that. Well, no, duh.
That is a really excellent way of putting it, I have to say.
Nice.
You hit the nail on the head.
And there is more and more evidence, on Skeptico. Oh man, I blanked on his name.
Is it Alex?
Alex
Yeah.
Hmm.
had on a pretty good guest who was also looking at near-death experiences more from a traditional standpoint. And one of the arguments he was making, Alex is like, well, look, these EKGs are flat and these people are having experiences. And the guy's like, well, that's true. He's like, I acknowledge that, but we can't tell exactly when these experiences are happening. We don't know if there's something deeper in the brain that the EEG is not picking up. And I'm like, okay, Alex didn't accept that, but I can see that at least being, a point, on this research. But when Alex is like, okay, what about when people see stuff that's going on in the room while they're dead, and that can be verified? And the guy just kind of avoided that question.
Hmm. Yeah, that's the hard bridge for a lot of those folks to cross, because it blows away the mind is the brain idea.
Yeah.
It just completely blows it away, and that's the very last thing they ever want to consider. It's scary, it's scary if your whole career, your whole way of believing is based upon materialism, to think that there's a possibility that we are bigger than the brain and the flesh and the meat puppet, the meat suit. Yeah, that's scary.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think a lot of people who tend to be more skeptically inclined are very willing to whip out Occam's razor and apply it when it will tear apart something in the esoteric fields. But when that is reversed, jumping through hoops to account for how people in near-death experiences can hear, see, know things that they shouldn't, they will quickly sheath it and put it away and not want to bring
razor. What razor?
Yeah, and that's the funny thing. It's my understanding, and maybe I might Google this as I'm speaking to you. It's my understanding that Occam's razor was actually a tool of a spiritual tool to begin with. Occam being a friar himself, using it to sort of explain certain spiritual truths. I'm sure someone's yelling at me on the podcast right now. I'm wrong, but
Well, the thing about near-death experiences is, if you throw out all the imagery and all the other stuff that goes with it, which seems to be culturally inspired to some degree, which also may have something to do with how we co-create on other levels, you do have those experiences where people can say, I heard this conversation going on, I saw the doctor do this. And when people are questioned who haven't had these experiences, they have no idea what was going on. It's not like these people are guessing. They're giving exact details. They can see from a very specific perspective what's happening to them. Or they go into the next room and they can repeat a conversation that was happening. Mm-hmm. Or the famous case where the person floated out the window and saw a red shoe on the ledge.
Right, yep.
That they couldn't have seen from any angle other than being outside the building. And the doctor went out and, not expecting to find a shoe, leaned out, and there was the shoe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a whole convoluted attempt to discredit that, which I found laughable. Again, it's the opposite of Occam's razor. It's Occam's Lego kit where you just build, you just take you're just building something. It's silly. I think anyone who's followed the veridical NDEs, that have been documented, you might be able to build a case against one or two of them, three or four of them, but some of the more compelling ones, you really have to twist yourself up to or ultimately, of course, just say the person's lying or they're just trying to make money off their story, or
Right.
I mean, ultimately, you when you fail otherwise, you go in for the character assassination, as we've all seen again and again.
And the minute the people go after character assassination, they don't have a case.
Exactly.
There was the other thing about near-death experiences is obviously the way it changes the person afterwards, and you don't see those profound changes from hallucinations. Or even if someone dies and is brought back, if they don't have that NDE, they don't have those significant changes. Now, if those changes were they had less brain function or symbolic of brain damage or something, that would be one thing, but it's quite the opposite, where they actually see increases in IQ. They become more peaceful, spiritual people. I mean, it's overwhelmingly positive changes most of the
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah, the proof is in the pudding, you know. I mean, not the proof that necessarily that it's an afterlife. You know, that's no one knows that. We may never know that. I don't think we'll ever have the technology to query that big mystery. But the proof in the changes in behavior and the changes in outlook and things like that. I mean, it's the proof that this experience is different than just a delusion, a hallucination. It's a big experience. It's similar. I'm doing a talk at American University next month on psilocybin, and I was looking back through my notes over that when I was starting to put my talk together, and seeing these deeply transformative, psychedelic experiences that people have. They're just so qualitatively different than a delusion, or especially with near-death experiences, are so often said, oh, it's the lack of oxygen to the brain. But no, when people have lack of oxygen to their brain, they get foggy and confused, and it's not a pleasant experience. It's orders of magnitude different than the experiences of an NDE or a psilocybin mystical experience or something like that. So, qualitatively, the explanations trotted out there to explain this stuff just doesn't hold up.
Yeah, and there's also the case. I think her name is Anita Morjani. Are you familiar with her?
Doesn't ring a bell. I don't think so.
no.
She was, let's see, what does it say here? She was born in Singapore of Indian parents, moved to Hong Kong, but she ended up with very severe terminal cancer. And apparently she has all the x-rays and everything else showing, and she was literally on the verge of death, had a very vivid near-death experience, and when she came back, the cancer was gone. And the doctors were like, we don't know. We don't know what's going on. And they kept checking her because they couldn't accept that the cancer was gone. They figured they were just missing it. And apparently she's fine.
That's amazing. Yeah. Well, let's just put that file away, shall we, fellas?
Yeah.
I mean, and at the same time, it doesn't prove life after death, but it proves that she went through something.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Whether the body created the whole experience and then healed itself, that still is a very significant mind over matter type of a situation.
Absolutely, yeah.
And here's something that I think we, to inject a bit of, not that we've been overtly negative, but to inject a bit of positivity into the conversation. I think we are chipping away at this. I think the acceptance of the reality of the placebo effect in scientific circles is sort of indicative of the fact that the establishment is starting to come around to some of these ideas. They just have to be really pedantic about explaining it, which I can appreciate too at the same time.
Yeah.
Sure.
And,
I mean, they can't jump in, and all, wild-eyed speculating like we can, nor should they, So yeah, I do agree. There is a growing awareness. And speaking of aware, there's I just looked on my Facebook page and found that the program is called Awareness During Resuscitation. They just released a huge prospective study. It's Sam Parnia, I think, is the researcher. He's written about NDs quite a bit, and so I encourage people and you guys too to take a look at that, because it's a huge study. And I think it just came out a couple of days ago, so it's hasn't quite crested as far as hitting a lot of people's attention. But if you just look up Aware, NDE study, it's a really cool, it's a really solid, very very well validated study.
And when we talk about, proof, again, I mean, it doesn't, none of this stuff proves what happens when we die.
Yeah,
No.
exactly.
Yeah.
It may very well be what happens when we die,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't prove it.
Mm-hmm. No, it's not proof. I think it's one of those things like, faith, religion, spirituality, where, you have to kind of assess the truth of it yourself, and you hear these messages that people bring back, and for some people they're going to sound trite. Eben Alexander, I think he talked about flying on a butterfly or something like that.
Right.
That sounds a little corny to me, but when I hear some of these other people saying they had a profound experience of God, or and they come back saying, hey, it's all about love, all this other kind of stuff. Yeah, that could be seen as trite, and a lot of people dismiss it and think it's silly. But who knows if that resonates with you, if that makes sense to you in a deep way, then maybe that's probably as close to proof as we're ever going to get.
But here's the thing, Al. If we can decouple consciousness from materialism, then we don't have to prove jack squat, because everything is back to square one.
Yeah.
Literally everything is back to square one.
Good point. Very good point.
One of the things about Jane Roberts' Seth work that impressed me was I think the first chapter I read in the Seth material, because I picked it up when I was doing near-death experience research, just seeing what was new and so on and so forth, and I would see all these very credible pages mentioning Jane Roberts and no other channeled entities, just Seth. And I'm like, what is it about Seth that people feel that's worthy of being included here?
Mm-hmm.
So I had a copy of Seth Speaks. I'd never read it, dug it up, flipped through to the chapter on death, and he describes very much what a near-death experience is. Except he's not talking about people coming back. He's talking about people who stay. This is what happens when you die. Mm-hmm. And he's talking about the idea that what you believe happens when you die deep down tends to be what you experience until you're acclimated to where you are. Mm. And I'm reading this, and he's also talking about how some people will have near-death experiences who are not dead, or some people can have this experience where their body's still alive for a little bit, mm-hmm. or they could stick with their body for a while before they actually go through this death experience. So there's no strict point of death. And as I'm looking through the near-death research, I'm seeing the same things. That they're showing that people who haven't actually died have a near-death experience. Mm-hmm. Or people who die don't have a near-death experience, obviously, is often the case too. Mm-hmm. And as I started comparing what he was saying to the research, and then I started looking back and saying, okay, when was this written? Okay, this was written in 1971. So when was the first book on near-death experiences written? And it was like 1973 or 1974, and I'm going, all right, I'm kind of impressed at this point.
Yeah.
Because he detailed that exactly what we're seeing in near-death experiences before there was any literature on it.
That's really interesting. I mean, I guess the only other literature would be like, the spiritualist literature, right. Where it's, where they got very elaborate about what the afterlife was like and things like that. But yeah, as far as nailing down the typology of an NDE, that's interesting. That's really interesting.
And that's what made me sit down and actually read the book. Because I was like, okay, I could see why this might be included. And I sat down reading the book with the intent of finding a way to kind of dismiss it. Mm-hmm. Because that type of stuff I've always felt was, if nothing else, it was just unconscious. Yeah. That it didn't have this like deep meaning to it. But as I read the Seth material, I'm going, okay, this is actually deep and very specific about how reality works. Mm-hmm. And none of it contradicted anything we had discovered in the 30 or 40 years since it's been written. And I was like, okay, I'm more impressed. The other thing that impressed me about it was Crowley had always said, beware lust of result.
Mm-hmm.
So in magical workings, if you focus on what you want to happen, the chances are it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I always thought, well, why is that? Why would that be the case? Because I mean, wouldn't focus cause something to happen? We always think, oh, if we focus really, you see movies and stuff where the person focuses their powers really hard on something and then it happens.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, why would it happen if you forget about it? You'd
Mm-hmm.
say, do your ritual, forget about it, and walk away.
Well, I mean, it's because I would assume that it's because the more powerful part of your mind, the unconscious part of your mind, is the one that's actually doing the focusing at that point.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
somewhere in the Seth material, he starts talking about symbols and how they work on the unconscious and how, the whole you create your own reality thing is very popular now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it seems to have stemmed from Seth, but Seth didn't say it quite like that. He would say you interact with your reality on an unconscious level.
Mm-hmm.
You don't just, manipulate it to be what you want it to be. If you want more money, you just focus on more money and, bring it to you.
Right.
He would,
The law of attraction. Yeah.
right. So his was very realistic, and it talked about the unconscious and how the unconscious takes symbols and then actualizes them, and so on and so forth. And I'm reading this going, so this is lust for result.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if the chaos magicians mind the Seth material, because the whole idea of the practice of using a sigil and and then focusing on it with intense energetic concentration and then letting it go. That was always the key of the chaos magicians is you need that burst of intense concentration, and then you forget about it, and then you let it work. That's interesting.
Let it go into your subconscious.
Mm-hmm.
And I always like the chaos magic principle that it doesn't, you use what works and means the most to you.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than following a strict guideline of, okay, here's how this magical spell works and what it does.
Mm-hmm.
Because those symbols mean so much more to you if you're picking them out,
Mm-hmm.
Well, and this to me, this is sort of what I was speaking with y'all about before the show. I've been mired in a bunch of alchemy these days, and a bunch of research of that. But to me, it's almost sort of speaks to the alchemical process, where you had to sort of set things up and then let the natural progression, whatever it is, to the next phase take its time and to do its thing. So there's this effort, and then this backing away from the situation and letting it go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great analogy. I've also been kind of knee deep in alchemy lately too, for whatever reason. I'm not sure, but suddenly there were about a dozen alchemy books all over my desk. So
it's a very confusing realm to dive into.
Man, sure. You are not kidding.
I was talking with Red Pill Junkie yesterday about it, and he said, "Oh well, that's just to keep it secret from the uninitiated." And I said, well, if I knew I was getting into this, I might have just as well stayed uninitiated.
But when you're looking at like the channeled stuff and you say, well, can you prove what it is? Even Jane Roberts sat back and said, I don't know what Seth is.
Mm-hmm.
She's like, it could be a part of my unconscious. It could be this. It could be that. But, I sat there reading this and going, okay, over the last 30 years, I think it was 30 years from the point it was written that I had read it, I'm going, this still holds up. This is, very specific, very detailed. It's not vague platitudes and, double talk. It was very specific. And I'm like, okay, so she may have been tapping into something unconscious. Maybe something else was half speaking through her. Mm-hmm. He would always say that he would never interact with anyone else the same way because part of what was coming through was her. It was his personality filtering through her.
Right. I think that's kind of become understood in metaphysical occult circles and things like that is your the whatever comes through, whatever it's coming through, again, like you said, whether it's part of your own consciousness or if you go so far as to think it's some other entity out there, it's always colored by the vessel that it's coming through.
Right.
You know, that seems to have become a bit of a truism. You know, whether it's, and it makes sense. You know, if whatever's working is working through an individual consciousness, an individual nervous system, and an individual's history and things like that. So you know, seems it seems that we always will need to, you know, keep that in mind when evaluating any channeled or, you know, other material alleged to be coming from somewhere else. So yeah, I mean, the Seth stuff. I read it in the late '70s. I think I just probably read Seth Speaks.
Right.
And later in life, I met a woman who was, you know, really, really into the Seth material, and yeah, I was a little skeptical, you know. But as far as channeled stuff goes, it's very coherent. It's clearly a well-defined system of thinking. You know, it's like you said, it's not just the platitudes and all. It's coherent, and it fits to all the pieces fit together. It's you know, if nothing else, if you only read it as stimulating entertainment, it's quality material, and like you said, it's held up. So I might have to take another look at that.
But
And the thing is, I tried to debunk it, and I even looked online for anyone else who had, you know, debunked this stuff. And the only thing you can find are some Christian groups saying she was possessed by a demon.
Of course.
Right. So, I mean, that's pretty much okay. Throw that out.
Mm-hmm.
And there's really nothing else. I mean, you can find tons of stuff debunking other channeled entities, but not that one.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, it doesn't, when it comes to evidence or proof, it doesn't, there's nothing there. You know,
Yeah.
you can't prove, even she didn't know what it was.
Mm-hmm. Nor can there be, you know, and the standard, you know, reply about any sort of channeled your entity or contactee communications or anything like that is, well, why don't they give us the cure for cancer, you know, or why don't they give us some mathematics that's provable? And I mean, that's actually a pretty good question, and you know, I think it's actually a great question. But what if these entities, you know, what if that's not what they're about, you know, or what if what if they're not scientifically advanced? Maybe they're, you know, there's all sorts of possibilities as to why, you know, we're not getting the cure for cancer, or we're not getting, you know, the equations so we could travel to other stars and things like that.
So let's from here, let's move into the ghost hunting realm. Right. Now, personally, I find some of it very interesting. Even I tend to watch Ghost Adventures, if for nothing else, because they amuse me. They do occasionally come up with some interesting technology. One of the things I've noticed recently is they're using the technology that the Kinect uses.
Huh. Okay.
To pick up shapes, and a couple of times they've picked up very small shapes climbing on people, just as the person goes, "Ooh, I just got really cold." You know, being a TV show, you always have to have that grain of salt to the side. Did they just fake this?
Mm-hmm.
I tend to believe they're not faking much, but they probably have to fake some stuff here and there.
Mm-hmm.
And I would think if they're going to fake it, it's going to be faked along with their belief system.
Well, yeah, and in my experience, TV shows tend to fake things in the editing more than actually fabricate things out of whole cloth. I know that it happens, but I'd have to say that they more like to play fast and loose with the sequence that things, or, you know, happen in and stuff like that. So I'm sort of on a similar page as you, Sarai.
But one of the things I found interesting, because I just watched the first episode of the new season earlier today, and again, for a moment, they caught a very small figure, and I'm thinking, why are all these figures they're catching small?
Yeah, I know where you're going with that.
You know, it's like, are we dealing with, you know, some kind of elemental demonic thing rather than an actual deceased person, which is always the assumption that most ghost hunters walk in with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the thing. You know, you have these ghost hunters going, well, we're here to prove this, but what are you really proving? You might prove there's something anomalous going on, but to prove that's actually coming from someone who's been formerly alive is a completely different story.
Well, yeah, and that's where what I would really like to see us, and where I think we have to go if we really want to see any headway in the ghost hunting realm, is that we have to redefine. We can't try to get the scientific establishment on board by saying, look, it's proof of life after death, or it's proof of, or we just need to try to get them on board with proving the phenomena that is commonly referred to as a haunting. So proving that something anomalous is statistically more likely to happen at this location in the case of a haunting. How about we just start there and then build out from that? Say statistically places do have faulty wiring, and then their lights are this statistically frequent to go out. But in houses built at this time with this wiring, it's less likely. Just started a real basic, boring nuts and bolts place with these locations being more statistically anomalous, and then build out from there, and eventually wind up at saying that there's some sort of discarnate intelligence, and then maybe then 100 years down the road, we can actually say life after death,
Well, you also have the how much does expectation play into these encounters? Are they creating these ghosts to some degree? Is there some kind of consciousness there that is molding itself to what they want to believe, or is that the only way it can actually interact with us?
Right. Is there like a feedback loop thing going on, with people expecting something, unusual to happen because it's an allegedly haunted house, and that expectation building up. I'm actually not a huge follower of investigations of hauntings, things like that. I was when I was younger, and the thing that I took away from all the books and research that I did then, and again, I haven't seen a lot of these shows, so I can't weigh in on that, is especially with poltergeist activity, it seems like it was fairly conclusively demonstrated, or at least widely believed in the parapsychological community, that poltergeists cluster around children or kids going through puberty.
Right.
And to me, that's the fascinating aspect of hauntings, in a particular focus of poltergeist activity, is that, and that may be different from alleged hauntings that are due to, spirits of dead people,
Right.
But wow, talk about that, busting down that wall of, of mind and spirit and mind and brain there. If we could see that these kids that are going through this traumatic experience, all these hormones and everything, if that can generate psychokinetic events, damn, we should focus on that more. I find that more intriguing than trying to find out if there's actually a ghost of a Civil War guy walking through the halls at night, something like that. Not that isn't equally fascinating in its own right, but I don't know where that's going to go. Same with near-death experiences. I think we can go so far into understanding what's happening, but we'll never get to where we want to go, and that is there life after death? I think that mystery just keeps that it's always going to recede, and I don't think technologically, we're going to have this Edison phone to talk to the dead or anything like that. I mean, I'd love to be wrong. I mean, please, I'd love for someone to prove me wrong on that. But when you have a poltergeist and you have a possible, explanation of what is happening, that you've got this sexual psychic energy that's causing chaos and is actually physically moving things, that seems like a really productive avenue to go down.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And when you consider that a lot of people who have near-death experiences or have UFO encounters, abduction experiences, also find themselves with occasional poltergeist activity.
Exactly.
It says something has been set off in the brain, because you see the same as Kenneth Ring showed some of the same after effects that you see with near-death experiences, you see with people who have experienced abductions.
Exactly.
And you don't see it with people who, have hallucinations or mental illness or something like that. You suddenly see these very specific things kicking up in their lives, and one of them is paranormal experiences, which definitely suggests that you're either more sensitive to it or to some degree you're creating it. And I think a lot of it comes down to is that we don't actually understand what reality is.
Yep.
we like to pretend we do. We like to, okay, yeah, so this is a vibration and that is a vibration. And when you think about it, literally everything is a vibration that your brain is putting into, some kind of concrete form for you to interact with. But it's not what's really there.
Every single thing is subjective.
Yes.
Every single thing.
Yes. And why does our brain put them together the way it does?
Because we'd go insane otherwise, I would think.
Exactly.
If the brain could correlate all its contents at once.
Yeah, that's why we need the reducing valve, You crank that thing all the way wide open and, I've seen what happens to people when that happens. If you're lucky, you get to shut that valve off, pretty quickly. If you're not lucky, I think, Godspeed,
Soraya, I was thinking, back to the idea of just ghost investigators in general. Have you ever spoken with or know the work of David Rowntree?
Not that I'm aware of,
Okay.
but the name does ring a faint bell.
I think he's doing some pretty good work. Last I heard, I don't know if anything's happened to, I feel like every other day in this field somebody else has mud in their eye. But last I heard, he was doing some really cool work where he was trying to find out a more efficient way to analyze EVPs because, normally you have to sit there with your voice recorder and listen for hours to these tapes and try to isolate the sound wave. But he actually started creating a vacuum in a bell jar and using a mic inside the bell jar.
Yes.
And was able to get EVPs without, obviously without any air pressure to make the to make the recording happen. So in that sense, that's sort of, I think, some really promising research, and that it proves that there doesn't need to be, you can have that sound in a vacuum, but also it's really cool because that way you can just look at the sine wave and see nothing until the EVP happens, pull that out, and then you've got your EVP. So I think that he's really approaching it in a scientific-minded way that I think is pretty promising.
And I want to say that Thomas Fusco was working with one where they disconnected the mic altogether and were still getting EVPs.
Really?
And I think it was Thomas. I'm not 100% sure on that. I haven't actually talked to him myself. I know I heard recently they were talking about it somewhere. But yeah, they would still pick up EVPs even with the mic disconnected, which says that it's imprinting directly on the device, not going through the microphone.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Italian guy whose name I forget, who had the radio that he would, it was an old tube radio or something like that he would get messages through and people could hear it. And then they took out the tubes and unplugged it. And apparently there were still voices coming through.
Interesting.
Huh.
Yeah, that's a really weird one. That's the first thing I thought of. So, yeah, God, it's such a minefield though. The whole EVP field. There's, and I've sat and listened. I've gone to talks where someone sat and played. Well, listen, you can hear them saying, "Hi, Sarah. This is me from the afterlife," and when you listen to it, it's How in the hell did you get that?
Well, there was this group that my one investigation that I've ever been on. They actually went on another investigation to Waverly Hills recently, and it's a good group of people. I know that they have their heads on straight, but they posted an EVP, and actually, it's a pretty damn good EVP. It's very clearly this voice of this little girl that just pops up, but I couldn't tell what it was. And I'm like, do you guys have any idea what she's saying? And they say, oh yeah, she's clearly saying turn on the laser. And I'm like, yeah, I don't hear that. Like, I think you got something there, but I don't necessarily hear that. And that's where the pareidolia comes in.
Yeah. Well, very, very early on the Ghost Hunters season, it might have been first or second season or so, they had gone to a a shop that sold like furniture for children, like babies and stuff. And of course, they're doing their standard. Let's find out who died here. Well, it's a fairly new building. No one's ever died there. And before there was a building there was really nothing. And so they're scratching their heads on who could be haunting this place, you know. And finally, they decided some woman named Jean that worked there, even though she didn't die there, she really loved the place. So that became their ghost. You know, if someone's haunting it, it must be Jean. And I'm thinking, why don't you just investigate without worrying about who, you know, without worrying about identifying the person first?
Well,
Because that wouldn't make good TV.
Well, yeah. And so, but anyway, they're walking through and they're thinking, well, this place doesn't really have much activity. And this was back when they actually aired episodes where they found nothing, you know, before there was stiff competition where they couldn't do that anymore, you know. So, you know, they're going through, well, they're not really finding anything. And they got this crystal clear EVP as they're walking around going, Gene, are you here? You know, Gene, talk to us. Gruff voice, crystal clear, going, there's no Gene here. And a few seconds later, it just goes, leave us alone.
Oh, tricksters.
And I'm like, well, if they were going to fake it, that's not what they would have used.
That's pretty good.
And it was so crystal clear. I mean, it wasn't, you didn't need them to play it 20 times and tell you what it said. You were just like, whoa. And then I'm thinking, you know, what if certain areas were very close to another dimension, not the dimension of the dead.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's another world just like ours. Mm-hmm. And in their world, they're hearing disembodied voices going, Gene, you know, Gene, come talk to us. And they're like, there's no Gene here. Leave us alone.
You know, it's interesting, sir. You were talking about the idea that, you know, well, who could possibly be haunting here? Let's assign an identity to the spirit. It sort of reminds me, and I've just come out of this reading Daimonic Reality, which is a fantastic book by Patrick Harper that we've talked about before in the past. And it's such a great, as I said, internally consistent model. But he mentions the presence of, or how doppelgangers sort of fit into that model. And to me, I mean, it seems pretty obvious that if you can have a doppelganger that moves of its own accord, then why does there have to be a spirit that is someone who died, you know, at one of these locations?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I had one experience where someone saw a doppelganger of me. And it was, unfortunately, when I was late for school. When I was back in, like, junior high school or something, I show up late, and I have to go into the office and, you know, sign in. And they're like, what are you doing here? And I'm like, I just got here. And they're like, no, you didn't. And I mean, I've always been very distinct looking. I mean, I had a jean jacket with a bunch of symbols on it and, you know, long hair. And so there was no one in the school who was going to be mistaken for me. And they're like, we've been watching you walk up and down the hallway for the last hour.
Oh,
weird.
Ooh.
And I had to have them call home and confirm that I was home before they would let me sign it, because they were like, there's nobody who looks like you. It was you. We both saw you. And I'm going, no, I was asleep.
Wow. I've got to use that in categories next time. Excuses for being late. Doppelganger.
Yeah.
Doppelganger. That's crazy. That is nuts.
That is.
And I've never had another experience like it. It was just, you know, and I don't even think I knew what a doppelganger was at the time. And I'm just going, what the hell are you talking about? I wasn't here.
I feel like I've had that happen a couple of times, but it's never been like, oh, I saw someone on the bus that looked just like you. I could have sworn it was you, but it's never been like at a place where I've been expected, which sort of ties into the Vartiga experience. Are you familiar with the Vartiga?
I don't know.
It's a Scandinavian spirit that is it's the idea. It's basically a spirit that presages someone's arrival. So I think I know I've had this happen to me, where you're sitting someplace and you hear the car door slam and you hear somebody come in and you hear them put down their keys and you say, hey, so and so, you know, I didn't realize you were back so soon, and there's no one there. And then they come in and they basically repeat what you've just heard later, you know. 10, 15 minutes later. So it sounds almost like you had a Vartiga experience there, because it was sort of presaging your arrival.
Or somehow I was projecting myself there when I was asleep.
Sure.
Yeah.
Why I would want to project myself there, I don't know, but, you know.
Does that mean all my naked at school dreams were actually happening?
Yeah, we didn't want to tell you about that.
Yeah.
Oh man, so EVPs, which I don't think we quite finished up with, again, don't constitute necessarily proof of anything specific.
They come so close. They come so
yeah,
close.
I mean,
it's frustrating.
it's when you get a crystal clear voice or a scream or something like that nobody heard when it was recorded. Yeah, that's really interesting. But to turn around and say this is proof of life after death or this is proof of ghosts, it's like, no, I think you got the concept of proof mixed up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's proof of what it is. That's all it is.
It's proof of something anomalous.
I feel like,
and I'm sorry. Go ahead, Josh.
no, I was just gonna say, I feel like the whole situation's gotten a little bit better with digital recording, so you don't have the something being taped over and having that sort of bleed through possibility happening. So I think that's been a positive development. Sorry, I just wanted to interject that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's so tough because even if there was a crystal clear message of someone saying, "Hi, this is Joe Blow coming to you from the afterlife," this, I guarantee you that if it's the most crystal clear message, it's a message from the afterlife saying this is confirmation. Someone takes that digital recorder apart, doesn't find anything wrong with it. There's no decent explanation for where the sound came from. It's still not proof of the afterlife.
Right.
That's the thing. So people who are clinging to EVP as if it's going to be the breakthrough, that Edison telephone to the dead that so many people want. It's never it's never going to be that. It's just going to be, And the people who are inclined to believe it's the message from Joe Blow transmitting live from, KROX heaven, they're going to believe that, and there's never going to be a skeptic who's going to, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
So that's the whole thing with evidence. It's EVP is just evidence of EVP. That's all it is.
Well, and back to my comment earlier about the way that science outpaced religion, and now I use religion as a loosey-goosey term. I think the supernatural. Science outpaced the supernatural, and now the supernatural has outpaced science. I think looking at the mirror image of that situation, you had the superstitious people who were denying science, and now I think you're always going to have the scientific people who are always going to be denying these other things moving forward. Mm-hmm. Not to take an anti-science stance, but I think my metaphor is sort of speaks for itself in that respect.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think any of us are anti-science.
No.
God, I sure hope not.
But you will be told that you are.
The thing about science, and we're going to flip the thing right here now too. The thing about science is that the scientific method is a very good method. However, you also have to hold into that equation that scientists with belief systems and biases are using that scientific method. And so when you see scientific theories come up, like dark matter, I think is the best example.
Yeah.
There's absolutely no evidence for dark matter, but you will see it presented as fact, not speculation, not theory. It's a fact that dark matter is out there because they don't want to look at another model to explain what they're seeing. So dark matter has to be out there.
Yeah, no, it's that sort of working backwards that is so indicative of scientism, as I would call it.
Yes, yeah, and black holes are the same thing. We can't prove there are black holes. Mathematically, we can prove there are black holes, but we can't see them because of their very nature. There could be other explanations for and when you look at like a press release about a black hole, it'll say, giant black hole discovered. And when you read through it, you find out what they actually discovered are some X-rays and gamma rays that they can't explain. So they've now decided those are black holes.
Well, yeah, and it's sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that I mean, and to me, like seeing the effects of something doesn't really equate to that. It certainly doesn't equate to it being what you think it is, and it doesn't necessarily even equate to that thing that you see the effects of being there in the first place. I mean, if we apply this exact same logic to reality, I could sit here and say that, well, look at reality. That's an effect of that means that there must be a creator. I can still use that same logic to work backwards and say, well, here's this effect, so that means that this other thing that I perceive as being the cause of that effect, that this other thing exists, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Uh, I wanted to interject. I actually am a editor, North American editor of a scientific journal. It's more biomedically related than space or physics or anything like that. But what we're seeing now, and it's making people very uncomfortable. There are a couple of editorials in the Lancet, one of the premier
Right.
medical journals, is that we're discovering that so much of our medical research, our biological research, falls apart completely when it's looked at again, when someone tries to replicate some of these studies. In a lot of cases, it's because they're done, with rats or something like that, and they do it with 10 when they should have used 20 or something like that. There's confirmation bias.
Right.
Scientists are just as guilty. They do a great job a lot of times.
Sure.
Building in ways to sort of cut out that the confirmation bias and the other things that tend to lead to errors. But when researchers are going back and looking at this enormous body of science that we base our medicine on. I mean, this is how we're treating people with particular drugs or for different conditions, and we go and look back, and it doesn't hold up. So much of it, there's a real crisis right now, and it's being recognized and talked about. Even though a lot of people who make their living doing research do not want to talk about this, but it's become very apparent that much of our science, especially biomedical science, is like made out of sand. So I tend to think, Soraya, that a lot of the physics-based stuff that we understand. I have a friend who's an astronomer. He's actually in training to be an astronaut, which is so cool. I mean, I love picking his brain about what's going on behind the scenes and all. But I tend to trust the astrophysicist and things like that. That what they're talking about is pretty solid, even if it's something like dark matter. That there's something there, and the numbers show us that something's there. Same with black holes and things like that. I think that kind of stuff is a little more established, but of course, then you get into string theory and some of that, which is just simply based on pure numbers, pure mathematics, trying to find a unified theory. So they're just building this thing, that gets bigger and more complex, and trying to shoehorn the reality of the universe into that. But I think there's a broad sort of understanding that a lot of the scientific assumptions that we've done, especially stuff that's based on practical research, might really be, the rug is being pulled out from under that. That's going to have enormous ramifications.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I look too at the work that people in the electric universe theory are doing, and they're the ones who initially were pointing out that there are other explanations for the stuff that they're trying to shoehorn dark matter into, but they're not willing to accept it because those explanations might take out the Big Bang Theory.
Mm-hmm.
And that has become so dogmatized in astrophysics that you're not even allowed to present ideas that don't use the Big Bang Theory. It's so assumed and it's so accepted as being proven.
Mm-hmm.
And they require of the paranormal these extraordinary amounts of evidence and proof. But when it comes to their theories, as long as it kind of fits in the general idea of their dogma, it's fine.
Well, that reminds me of what Terence McKenna said about the Big Bang Theory. Just give us one free miracle and we will roll on from there.
Exactly. Man, I wish that guy was still around.
I know. I know.
Yeah. His last book is coming out, too, very soon.
Oh, really? He had a book that wasn't published?
Yeah, I believe so. I think I just saw something about it yesterday.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Yeah, he was apparently in the course of writing 4 of them when he died.
I
That
think
doesn't
he would.
surprise me, yeah.
I think he would be extremely dissatisfied with the state of the world. Although I think he would be very happy about the psychedelic movement, which really has legs these days. But I think,
True.
in terms of the way that the direction that we're going as a planet, he would be very upset about that.
I agree.
If you look at another something that probably people, let me try and talk again. People are probably more familiar with who listen to this show and stuff. You have the work of Robert Schoch.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And his battle with the scientific establishment, where he pretty much proves with factual information that the Sphinx is likely older than they think, and they spit in his face. And I believe the one quote was, "Your facts disagree with our theories, so your facts must be wrong."
They literally spit in his face, correct?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
man. Well, that's like the editor of Nature saying, Rupert Sheldrake's book should be burned.
Yeah.
Calling for book burning, because it's magic. Which
so
was
infuriating.
yeah.
And it's not the spirit of science. It's people that make these decisions and kind of like cut off the open channels. It's belief systems, and it's this, it's no different than the people who believe that EVPs are proof of ghosts.
Mm-hmm.
It's just in a different light. I mean, it's human nature, if nothing else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's belief systems. Again, we get back to Robert Anton Wilson and the reality tunnel idea, and your reality tunnel is going to be especially well constructed and impermeable if your livelihood depends on it, and the livelihood of everyone depends on it, or if you're if it's crucial to your conception of who you are. I am a scientist, or I am a fundamentalist Baptist. If once your belief becomes who you are rather than something that could be ephemeral or it could change or mutate, then you're pretty locked in. You're not going to want to see anything outside of that tunnel.
Yeah. Yeah, and as Robert Schoch said, when he presented this to the Egyptologists, he thought they were going to be happy. He thought they were going to be like, "Hey, you found us something new to investigate," and instead they were like, "How dare you?"
Yeah. And then Göbekli Tepe comes along, and
yeah,
oh yeah, well maybe there were people that could construct these things back then.
But it seems like the archaeological community hasn't really admitted to that. It's just kind of like, yes, that's a fascinating site, Yeah,
the ancient ancient alternative historian movement, as it were, I think has a lot of the best evidence in their favor, and it seems like it would be one of the fields that would be the easiest to rewrite. But it seems like they really tend to be some of the most dogmatic of the scholars who are out there. But I mean, the evidence is overwhelming, and it's this idea that that we have it all laid out as to exactly how things were, and that's just it just reeks of hubris.
Mm-hmm.
You also find that I totally forgot where I was going with this.
Robert Schoch.
Yes, Robert Schoch and but it wasn't Robert Schoch. I was thinking Graham Hancock.
Okay.
Oh yeah, he has a new book coming out soon too.
Yes,
exciting.
Magicians
Yeah.
of the Gods.
Yep.
There is more evidence for some of these alternative theories than what the accepted theories were actually based on.
Not
But that's
surprising.
okay, because when you look through, like, why is the Sphinx dated to where it's dated? Well, they have this stele that says, so and so uncovered it from the sand, and it's like, wait, he uncovered it from the sand? That's sounding like it was already there.
Yeah,
No,
it
no, no.
does.
That means he built it. It's like, no, you don't know that. Okay, what evidence do you have to support that he built it? Well, nothing. We're just kind of guessing that this is, they throw out guess, and it's like, wait a minute. So you're telling Robert Schoch he's wrong, but you're guessing as to how old it is.
Hmm.
Yeah,
And you find that more and more with some of these archaeological stuff. They didn't know, so they made an educated guess, but then it becomes kind of written in concrete,
Hmm.
and anyone who
Hmm.
challenges it gets spit upon.
Hmm.
well, what amazes me constantly is how we are we just continue to make the same follies of the past. I mean, you look back even 50 years ago, and the stuff that people were doing supposedly for their health or that weren't bad for them is a completely different set of. I mean, the Lysol used to be marketed as a feminine hygiene product.
Hmm.
You look at people who were given a laudanum on at the drop of a hat. I mean,
Hmm.
these are horrifying things, and but we for some reason we think that we have no reason to revise anything that we have in any of the things that we think we know so far. We're like, no, this is all true. This is all true. So now we can progress from here. But we're so hesitant to revise things and to take a step back and say, is this really good for us? Is this really the way that we think it is? It's bizarre.
Hmm. And part of the problem with that is it turns into a relativism, like, oh, they said margarine, I should have margarine instead of butter, and now butter's good again. The hell, I'm just going to eat anything, and
Yeah.
people just sort of give up, um, because it feels like science is just unmoored, when really it does kind of progress. But you're right, we keep making the same sorts of mistakes, and that's part of the reason too why I think there's a lack of faith, so to speak, in science. That's why we see that, you know, almost every climatologist from every country on this planet is saying, hey, look, things are warming up, and it's due to all this crap, that we've been pumping into the air by, burning fossil fuels and running our cars and all this. But yet there's an enormous contingent of people out there who don't believe it. They'll believe an astrophysicist. They'll believe a chemist when he explains chemical reactions. But when people who've spent their lives studying climate are saying, "Hey, it looks pretty damn sure that that all that fossil fuels we've been burning over the years are now heating up our atmosphere, and that could be a real problem." When you've got 40 some percent of the American public who don't believe that. It's strange.
Well,
It's bewildering.
the worst thing to ever happen to climate science was to have, excuse me, was to have people of any sort of any political leaning, to get behind it, because then it becomes polarized, and you
Yeah.
see all these memes of their personal behavior not reflecting what they say that the world should do, and it becomes this web that ends up confusing people, and it's the worst thing that could have happened.
Well, what's confusing people is the same thing that confused people about cigarette smoking and the dangers of tobacco, and that's there is an enormous amount of money generated by people who were selling coal, by people who were selling oil, and
Sure.
they have an enormous amount of money, and even a lot of the smarter people I know that sort of deny that what seems very obvious to me, that if you keep pumping these gases into that little realm of atmosphere surrounding this ball of rock that we're on, that some bad things can happen. Even what they say, and it's become a common argument, is, well, those scientists, there's money behind them too. Well,
Sure.
yes, of course there's money behind them. But do you know how much money there is behind, Exxon Mobil and
Right.
Royal Dutch Shell and all these guys? And if you look at the main figures who are out there, who are pushing the idea that the science is not settled, inevitably, I plug, whenever I get into which I don't discuss it that often anymore, because it just, I've especially in places like Facebook, where it's really just become, an intractable sort of time wasting, soul destroying thing to try to talk about this issue. But I say, look, someone will send me a paper. Hey, look, this scientist says that, there is no such thing as global warming and blah, blah, blah. I take the guy's name, I plug it into the SourceWatch website, and, bing, 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 here comes the list of ties to fossil fuels, to, the Heartland organization, which is, where most of these people come from. It's transparent. Like, if you actually take the time to look and see where these arguments are coming from, follow the money. It's like Watergate. You follow the money, and all the money goes back to these oil and petroleum and coal companies and things. So but the cause of that is that people have given up faith in any kind of science. I mean, we like to point out the problems in scientism and with the scientific community, but man, I'm defending these guys, at the top of my lungs with every last bit of of passion I can summon, that science is good.
Now, here's
my view on the whole climate change thing is this. First of all, I think it should be called climate change, not global warming, because I think that does screw some people up, because they'll be like, but the winters are getting colder.
Right, exactly. Yes.
But that's part of, because other things are warming up, etc. They don't understand the big picture.
Right.
So I think climate change is a better word for it.
Mm-hmm.
I also think the sun has a lot to do with it, but you can never pump this amount of stuff. I mean, everything affects everything else. If you pump that amount of chemical into the air, it's gonna have an effect.
Yeah.
And there's no way it cannot. It's not just gonna go away out into space.
Right.
So I mean, how much of an effect the sun has, I'm sure we'll find out over the next 20 years or so, as they keep saying that we're going to get into a sun-spotless cycle that could cool everything down. Mm-hmm. Maybe they'll balance each other out.
Yeah. I would like to echo your sentiments, Soraya, because I feel like anybody with a brain thinks that air pollution is bad, and I think that anybody following things cannot help but think that what we are doing is not helping. I do think that there is, especially given how long we've been keeping records, I do think that there is a cyclical component to this. Have either of you followed any of the work of Randall Carlson?
I've had Randall on a few times.
Yeah, I've had Randall on a few times. Okay. Mm-hmm. I know that he has a lot of things to say about this, and it's not me. The work of people like him is one of the things that really does give me pause. But at the end of the day, we're still ending up churning tons of pollution into our environment, and we're still using a very finite fuel source. So, I think it's important to break free of that model.
And if you look at it this way. Okay, so what's the worst thing that could happen if we clean up the planet and stop using fossil fuels? Yeah. Hey, we cleaned up the planet and we stopped using fossil fuels.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
You don't have ozone warnings anymore. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah. And acid rain and and who knows what else it's affecting that we're not even aware of yet.
Yeah. Well, that's, I didn't mean to go off on a tangent on that, but there's a really interesting overlap to me within, sort of the paranormal community and things like movements to me that seem to be very unscientific.
Oh yeah.
Such as the denial of the effects of these gases and carbon dioxide and stuff like that we're pumping into the atmosphere. It's strange. And it's also an overlap with the conspiracy field too.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
so as much of a critic as I am of the excesses of science, I see that there's this new sort of anti-scientism too, that especially in alternative and the field of the paranormal, and especially in conspiracy thinking, things like that, where I've that's equally infected the fields,
Mm-hmm.
the stuff that we like to study. And I don't know where I'm going with that, but I mean, as much as the paranormal has always been criticized for being unscientific, unfairly so, I feel like there's this detachment, and maybe it's because people aren't really learning science like they used to, or they're not experiencing it. I'm not sure.
I think it's at least partially. I think it's a reaction to certain things. I mean, I feel like I feel like it could perhaps be a reaction to the materialist paradigm, if that makes any sense. Alex Sakaris on Skeptico had a speaker on about 2 weeks ago, and who was, and Alex thinks, in this interview, that materialism begets materialism, and materialism begets, a devaluation of life. And I think maybe some of the anti-science stuff that we do see popping up is sort of an outgrowth of that, not to justify it. I read so many, like, I subscribe to some things on Facebook, and I see them nowadays on my feed, and I like to sort of keep abreast of what people are talking about in these fields. But some of them make my toes curl. Especially like conspiracy things, or like every other day there's something seen on Mars, and I'm like, are these?
Oh
Is this?
yeah. Oh
Is this
yeah.
is this who people think I'm? Do people think I'm seeing things on Mars? Because that's not me.
Yeah, yeah, it's that there is such a that's the perfect example of it too. I saw today, and it gets recycled in places like the Daily Mail and things like that. They get a lot of clicks. It's clickbait in a lot of ways, but it really does.
Yeah.
You know, I wonder how many people think. I would hope that people that read my stuff understand that I'm not seeing the Star Destroyer on Mars 4 inches long, and claiming it's a UFO or something like that. But it does sort of pollute the areas, the things that we dig into. And you don't want that sort of thing becoming associated with I certainly don't want someone saying, gee, I wonder if Mike has seen this 4-inch crash star destroyer on Mars. He'd probably really love this.
But
Yeah.
public service announcement: if myself or Soraya or Mike see something in a Mars picture that looks legitimate, we'll be the first on that bandwagon. It's just we haven't seen anything
Exactly.
yet.
I would say there are definitely things that look mildly anomalous.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. No,
That crab thing. Remember have you seen the crab thing that
I
was
don't know if I've seen the
recently?
crap.
Yeah.
I know there was what they called an android head, and I went, okay, that definitely looks out of place.
Uh,
But I mean, that's not proof that it's anything.
right. It's just, hey, why don't you move the rover a little closer? Let's
Right.
let's take a look at that, please, will you?
Yeah,
You look at Cydonia. Okay, well, there are definitely some weird alignments there, but that doesn't prove it's not natural. Why NASA said, okay, well, we're not going to look. It's like, okay, if there was even the slightest chance that was artificial, why the hell aren't you looking?
yeah. And
Well, they don't want to. They don't want to, appear to be, adjusting their priorities according to, crazy people, or
Yeah.
those crazy conspiracy freaks. So I think that there's an element, of NASA just trying to avoid any kind of you know dealings with that sort of thing.
I do think there are some moon shenanigans.
Like what?
Oh, you had to corner me on it now, didn't you?
Yeah.
Like,
I mean,
objects on the moon, or
just
maybe they haven't told us the full truth about about the whole trip to the
there are
moon.
just some strange geographic anomalies that have to do with the moon. In terms of like I'm sure you've heard that the moon, when struck, is hollow. Yeah.
Right.
Um,
But that's not something that even NASA necessarily debates because it doesn't have the mass it should for the size it is.
right.
They think there are big hollow open spots within the moon. So I mean that doesn't even fall into
Oh,
conspiracy. The question becomes why are they
yeah, I'm
there?
sorry. I wasn't even necessarily talking about a cover up or anything. I was just talking about something being odd about something being off about the moon because you do hear about supposedly moon structures or something. That's not necessarily something
Yeah,
that
yeah.
I'm on board with either. But I feel like there's something strange about the moon.
Well, there's no theory that works that explains why we have the moon.
Right.
There's a bunch that almost work, but they all have problems. And there was one scientist who said, "Well, the best theory about why the moon is there is that it's a hallucination."
Nice, nice,
Well,
nice.
here's one for you guys. You may have heard this before, but when I first read it somewhere, it was one of those things where the top of my head just about popped off, and I felt stupid for never having thought about it. But isn't it interesting that the moon, observed from Earth, is exactly the same size as the sun from our
Yeah.
perspective on the ground? Like what are the chances?
Well, and I mean, to sort of riff on that, Mike. The fact that we never see the other side of the moon, the fact
Right?
that
Yeah, yeah.
all the rotations and whatnot have aligned perfectly in that regard. Now, of course, this is where Richard Dawkins would step in and say, "Well, you can't say that because something exists that." Just because it seems miraculous, well, if it wasn't miraculous, if it wasn't that way, if the moon wasn't perfectly equidistant from the Earth, or if it wasn't that particular distance from the Earth, then you wouldn't even be here to notice that.
Right.
You know, which I can understand. It doesn't hold water with me on a gut check sort of level, but I can understand that line of logic.
It's definitely odd that it happens out that
Yeah,
way,
it's
especially
if
since it
nothing
doesn't
else, it's
happen.
cool. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah,
so
And it doesn't happen on any other planet.
hmm
yeah.
Well, then
There's
when you
Well,
get really down to the nuts and bolts and the mathematics, I mean, when you look at the precession of Venus, it makes a perfect five-pointed star.
hmm
Yeah,
hmm
so there's just this cool math, embedded in so many
cos-
things.
cosmic sacred geometry.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
There is a book, and I picked this up at a Barnes and Noble or something years ago called "Who Built the Moon."
Uh-huh.
Uh, Christopher Knight and Alan Butler did. And I looked at it and I thought, okay, that's kind of silly. And then I flipped through it a little bit and I put it back and I went, and then I kind of picked it up again and I'm like, all right, this seems like it might be an interesting. I'm not reading a book about who built the moon, and I put it back. And then I left, and the next day went, I gotta go back and get that book. And I have to say, the majority of the book, I mean, the who built the moon part is speculation, obviously.
Mhm.
But they spend most of the book talking about the anomalous features of the moon,
Mhm.
the various theories of how the moon came to be where it is, and how none of them quite work because they go over the theory and all the problems. And it's really a fairly interesting book.
Mhm.
And the quote that I just said I had a little bit wrong because it was in this book, and it says the best explanation for the moon is observational error. The moon does not exist, and that came to Erwin Shapiro of the Harvard Smithsonian Center for
Hmm.
Astrophysics,
Uh,
because there's no good explanation for how it got to where it is.
mhm. The book I read was similar. It was called like Our Spaceship Moon or something like
Yeah,
that.
it was
Yeah,
older.
might have
Yeah,
been the same author. I'm not sure. Yeah, that
no,
was
it's not. I know
okay.
they actually reference that one.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh. That was really interesting. I have to wonder now. I'd love to get my space physics pal on this panel at some point. But I wonder how much of that still holds up over the years. Now that we've learned a lot more, our technology has gotten better, at understanding that sort of thing. I would just be curious, if anyone has revisited some of these, lunar anomalies and things,
Right.
and what they would say now. Just open question, I guess.
And you also have things on the moon like the luminosities and things like that. But I think you're looking at electrical phenomena, and I think that slowly, even if the electric universe theory is never completely accepted with science, they're starting to take pieces of it.
Mm-hmm.
Why they're denying the electrical aspects of things, I'm not really sure, because there's plenty of evidence for it. But when you look at it under those constraints, the luminosities aren't that weird. They seem weird if it's a dead world with nothing going on, but when you realize that everything interacts with everything else electrically, well, then you would expect to see luminosity on the moon.
I'm not familiar with the whole electric universe thing, so I'll get on that.
Well,
that sounds really interesting.
I have a feeling last time I listened to someone speak about it, I think it was Fusco, it's a lot to wrap your head around.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, yeah, it is. And there's different aspects of it. There's the Saturn concept, that Saturn was our original moon and we were at a completely different configuration, which is, like, when I first heard it, I thought, well, that's really interesting, but I'm not sure there's anything to it. And then the more I read what they're basing it on, I'm like, okay, I'll at least give it a few points for being interesting and slightly possible.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at the science aspects of it and take, and get rid of the mythological connotations of Saturn as a second sun and all that, it stands up on its own. And they've made a lot of predictions as we've sent probes out places of what we're going to find, and they've been dead on. Whereas the established astrophysics and stuff have been wrong. And I'm like, okay, that in itself says the mainstream should be looking at this theory, at least, giving it a glance here and there and saying, does this work? Is this, going to solve some of our mysteries? They don't have to accept it wholeheartedly, but you would think science, being as open as it is, I mean, if you're making predictions and those predictions are accurate, you may very well be onto something.
Well, you know what else is starting to pop up recently on the same sort of thing is mainstream scientists talking about there may be a large planet out beyond Pluto. The whole, which starts to, bring up the whole Planet X and, Sitchin's work and all that sort of stuff. So, it's funny how these, discarded ideas as wacky, every once in a while they start cropping up again. And, it's serious mainstream discussion that there could be a very large planet, out beyond where we thought planets ended. So
right, or two of them.
Yeah, or two. Yeah.
Although I lean more toward the idea that we're actually in a binary star system with another star. I've had what's his name, Walter Cutchin, on a couple of times about this. And his calculations and stuff match up with stuff they've been discovering about how fast the solar system is moving and so on and so forth. It also explains precession. And even if it turns out that we're just moving around a spot in space rather than another star, this was saying Laird Scranton was suggesting that the whole local system there's another level of rotation going on. It still would, it's the next step beyond, okay, there are planets out there, would be, okay, we're in another orbit somewhere. Walter Cruttendon's ideas that we're actually in a binary system with Sirius are very interesting.
Oh, yeah. Anything with Sirius perks my ears up.
I found those interesting. I think I'm a little bit more skeptical about that sort of thing, and I'm not really sure why, because you'd think that I would be the first person to jump up and be ready to adopt something like that. But again, if I think about it in terms of a gut check, I'm not sure exactly how I feel about that.
Sure. Well, I think Sirius is an interesting choice of a binary system. I mean, but one of the interesting things that was pointed out is that as Sirius B moves around Sirius A, the Earth's rotation, when it's aligned, slows just slightly. And that should not happen under any circumstances.
Right, and to me, that's where a lot of these theories' real importance lies. Is if it can point out flaws in existing theories, then they've already proven their worth in my opinion.
It's at least worth examination.
Yeah.
But it doesn't fit a mainstream dogma at the moment, so it's not going to be seriously looked at. But as they accept more and more that there could be extra planets out there, eventually, if we don't find those planets, it might move to another star. And it might be a brown dwarf or something that we just can't see. Instead of a large planet, it could be a large star that is not giving off light.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we know very little about our solar system when you think about it. I mean, we extrapolate its history based on what we see today, but we don't let that cataclysm element into it.
Well, and you were talking about, the nature of reality. I mean, it, in some sense, besides the moon, which I do think we've gone to, besides the moon, what can we really, in some sense, say that we know about any of this? I mean, yes, we have tools for observation, and yes, I do think that we're in a solar system, and yes, I do think that, I think that all these things are out there. But in terms of like, if you want to get really, philosophical about it, how do we, we've never set foot on anywhere else in the solar system. We've never, I mean, if we are, as some scientists or as some theoreticians have decided to bandy about these days, living in a holographic universe, as far as we know, you get 10 feet beyond the moon and it's all a simulation.
Or from a quantum level, what if none of it really has a state until we actually get there to check it out?
Yeah, exactly.
It's in sort of a flux until we actually get there and observe it with something, and then it goes, okay, now we're this.
Yeah, now we're locked in. Yeah, and I'm glad that you sort of mentioned that, Sarai, because that's what constantly boggles my mind, is that we can have things like the observer effect be completely accepted on a scientific level, and these other things, which I think make a lot more intuitive sense to me, like the evidence for consciousness not being an epiphenomena of the brain, the idea that there might be a North American ape running around. These to me seem, from my day-to-day life and from the in terms of the plausibility factor in my life, these seem like much tamer concepts than something like the observer effect. And I wonder, and I'm not saying that any of these things have to be accepted by the establishment, but give them the time of day, please.
Yeah. And the other thing on the flip side, on the scientific side, is peer review. And peer review, of course, was established so that people could look at the work and decide whether or not it had validity or not, and give it some sort of a stamp of approval. But you also find that there are these people who have tested the peer review system and have taken a peer-reviewed document and basically just switched the name to an unknown scientist at a tiny college and run it through the peer review and had it rejected. Or vice versa, taken a document that was rejected and put a big name on it with a big college on it and sent it through and it gets accepted.
Well, yeah, it's the system. That system is definitely very broken. That's what I was touching on earlier too, about the biomedical field, is that so much of it is broken, and no one wanted to admit it. And now I think the cracks have just gotten too wide, and we're starting to say, wait a minute, this is just a giant, sandcastle we've built, and the wave is washing it away. And, what are we going to do? How do we deal with that? And I think that could be part of the turning point against scientism, against the cult of science.
Right, as opposed to science itself.
Yes,
right.
That's we might need, it might be a real revolution in the way we see things. That sure would be nice. I mean, I think it's necessary. because the pendulum has swung so far towards materialism that it's just inevitable that it's going to reach that apogee and then it's going to swing back. I feel like the swing might have begun. Maybe it's wishful thinking on my part, but I'm seeing more and more dribs and drabs. That might be happening.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Mike. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the whole psychedelic movement. I think I'm seeing a lot of young people online engaged in that community, and not necessarily doing it for the recreational use that I've seen a lot of people doing, and actually doing it and trying to find out something more about themselves and about reality.
Right.
And so I think that is a part of it, a big part of it.
That is a big part of it. I agree, absolutely. Well,
All right.
guys, my brain, I think, is just it's shrunk from all the heavy duty thinking I've been doing. So I might have to bow out soon
Yes,
and
well, I was gonna say, I think we're
recharge
gonna
the
wrap
gray
this up.
matter.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
We covered, I think, everything I wanted to get to.
Awesome.
So,
So can we talk about something really simple next time?
well, we're throwing around ideas, so we'll be back with two of you and probably some special guests very soon.
Yeah, this is really a highlight for me. It's like this little virtual get together with two really smart guys that like the same weird stuff that I do. So I hope the people out there are enjoying it as much as I'm enjoying it, because this is great. I can't, this is what this is what I do all the work for, is to sit around and talk about it and, laugh and, and get feedback. So just.
And real quick, where can people find you online?
Me, michaelmhughes.com.
And Josh?
JoshuaCutchin.com.
What were you going to say, Mike?
I was just going to say all the other stuff I do, just, that's sort of the satellite. So, if someone's interested in the tarot stuff, they can go to that website, and then, they can branch out to some of my other websites. And I know we're all on Facebook, and I'm on Twitter. I don't know if you guys are Twitterers too.
I do my best.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I'm not a Twitter machine, but I try to let people know I'm still alive there. So,
all right, thank you both.
Hey,
Thank
thanks
you
so much. Really appreciate it, guys.